Hello, everyone. Oh, I have host privileges now. Hello, everyone who is watching. I hear the echo. Go. Sorry about that. Welcome to our panel, Fantasy in the Dark of Night. Sorry about if there are any sound issues. I'm not sure what's going on. But today we're going to be talking about folklore and creatures of mythology and folklore, and potentially creatures of the more horror genre. Creatures that we are fascinated with and love writing about and studying, and how that relates to our emotional struggles and humanity. And so I'd like to let all of our panelists introduce themselves. Let's start with Yisheng.
Hey, hi everyone. My name's Yisheng. I'm a Singaporean writer and researcher. My pronouns are he, him, and I have a solo collection of short stories that's available as an ebook as well as a physical book called Lion City, which is, I've called it magical realism plus there's a fantasy, a bit of sci-fi. But although I've sort of drawn on Southeast Asian and Singaporean monsters here, the main place that I've been accessing that lore is as a researcher. And so, I've been writing essays and channeling that into works that I haven't yet published. So I'll be talking a lot more about that lore, I suppose. Yeah.
Elizabeth, do you want to go next?
My name is Elizabeth R. Moore. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a German writer, birder, and literature grad student. My stories have appeared in Strange Horizons, Luna Station Quarterly, and more. My fiction features ghosts, strange plants, and the German experience. And I live with my wife and 2 cats and an extremely lazy dog in the Ruhrgebiet in Germany. And I'm just really excited to talk about stuff because as a German, we are very, very obsessed. We're very obsessed with ghosts in general and memory and the past. And so I'm just really excited to chat about that.
All right. And Marie?
I'm Marie Brennan. I'm most well known as the author of the memoirs of Lady Trent, which are about a woman who is studying dragons as a field biologist. But prior to that, I wrote the Onyx Court series, which are historical fantasies set in London, and those dealt a lot with the fairy folklore of the British Isles. And one of my more recent novels is The Night Parade of 100 Demons, which some of the people attending this panel might recognize that as the Hyaki Yagi, the Japanese motif of basically a parade of many yokai causing chaos during the summer. And I also have an academic background in anthropology and folklore, both as an undergrad and a graduate student. So I think all of us have a little bit of the academic scholarly take on this as well.
Okay. Yeah, I should also probably take a moment to introduce myself as your moderator. I'm your resident moderator, Emily. I also go by Emma Lloyd because that is the name of my YouTube channel where I do booktube and video essays. So I guess thanks for all for introducing yourselves. So I will start with a first question. So everyone here, I think, has certain creatures that they are interested in and that they like studying and writing about. So what makes you resonate with the particular creatures which you like studying or writing about, and what prompted these more in-depth explorations, and maybe talk about stories from your childhood or maybe some spiritual or cultural influences.
I guess I'll go ahead and leap on that. I always feel a little bit weird with this because it's not that I have some deep connection going back. Really, all of these have been I came up with ideas for what sounded like interesting stories involving these things. With the dragons, it was literally just combination of a D&D source book, the Draconomicon from 3rd edition, that had like skeletal drawings of dragons, a discussion of their life cycle. And I had not the book Dragonology, but one of the wall calendars that's like a field guide to different dragons. So that just kind of made me go, what if you were like a Victorian era, like natural historian trying to study them? And, you know, that's my deep and meaningful answer for why did I write about that? You know, similarly, the Onyx Court stuff I played in a role-playing game, Changeling the Dreaming, for anybody who knows it, that deals with fairy stuff. And so, you know, I don't actually have the deep childhood connection, but possibly other people here do.
Isha? Yep.
Oh, thanks. Okay, this is going to be incredibly cliche, but I am going to talk about the Pontianak. Okay, the Pontianak is the most famous of the Malay hantu or spirits. She is the most common legend is that she is the spirit of a woman who died in childbirth, and she comes back for revenge. She's a danger, and different stories say she's a danger to women giving birth, or she's a danger to the men who wronged her. She is very vampirical. She's a man eater, and yet and she's very much present, still feared in Singapore and Malaysia today. She's you know, a lot of my friends are still scared to say her name. She's usually in a white dress, long black hair, a bit like Sarako of the Ring, and and yet she's also got this very weird Freudian thing that if you hammer a nail into the back of her head, she will become the perfect wife. And yeah, so there's and this is. I'm saying this is cliche because she's been portrayed in so much of our film, in our fiction, in since the 1950s, and she is, if you don't know much about, if you don't know anything about Malay culture, yeah, she's the figure that you're most likely to know about. But when I've been and in my research, I've also realized how many strange permutations she takes on. There are a lot of queer readings of her, a lot of feminist embraces of her. There's arguments that she's actually descended from a protector goddess of the forest and became seen as demonic only when Islam became prevalent in this part of the world. And yet, and there are also, I'm not Malay. Malays are indigenous to my part of the world, but I'm Chinese. I'm part of a settler race, and I've noticed quite a number of Chinese Anglophone writers seem to have very much misunderstood and appropriated her story. And I'm worried that when I write about her, I'm continuing that pattern. And also part of my research, I discovered there are variants of her across Southeast Asia, from Thailand to Sumatra and the Philippines, and I even made myself a T-shirt with like all her variations. Yeah.
Well, there's also similar stories in other parts of the world, like especially the whole some kind of ghost or spirit or demon of a woman who died in childbirth. Like that's really common because dying in childbirth was really common. So yeah, it's not surprising to me that it's widespread, not just through that region, but you see similar kinds of things around the world.
Okay. Oh yeah, in the Philippines, like the aswangs, super common. I think it's also real. What's slightly odd for me about the Pontianak is how she's really become embraced like a symbol for a lot of people. Like she is both feared and loved in that way that that's both kind of gorgeous. All right, sorry.
And Elizabeth?
Yeah, so as I said in my intro, I'm German, and And part of the reasons I love ghosts so much is because growing up in Germany, Germany is essentially like a country that is just like a patchwork of like a lot of like physical reminders of both World War One and World War Two. And like one of the big things that I am always working on when I'm talking to Americans about what it's like to be German, like when I introduced my American wife to Germany, she was horrified and amazed at how often I would just be like, oh yeah, so this was a really nice area, but it got bombed to bits. So then we had to build this stuff in the 50s. And so it's very much a like physical patchwork of what all these like historical layers that are very physically present, and as a result are like very woven into like the culture. German culture in general is also like very traditions based and sort of very much unlike the US. We have this concept of like when like it's pride if your parents helped you do a thing, like it was and so there is just this idea of like continuity, and like you living in your parents' house is seen as like a sign of success and that you did like a good thing, even if you're like 26. And culturally, like that's so different. And so I felt like I really love talking and thinking about ghosts because they're this like liminal space where they're both the past, but they inform the future. And so there is a lot of conversation in general about those sort of two connections. My work in academia is also very much interested in that concept, which is known as memory culture, which is just sort of how do we interact with our own past and how much do we like talk to it. And so a lot of my work has been really interested in like how do we talk to like the soldiers that we wronged and stuff. And so that's been sort of my big fascinations with ghosts. It's very interesting though, because sort of culturally ghosts in like the 16th and 17th century weren't that important to German fiction. Like a lot of our fairy tales and stuff are interested with different kinds of the undead, but a lot of the times you have dead bodies either come back to life or just sort of be dead bodies. And so I think it's really interesting because sort of ghost narratives only really started being interesting in German literature itself in the 20th and 21st century.
That's all really interesting stuff, and I guess we that it's a good segue into my next question, because I think we've mentioned some academic background in literature, folklore, something related, and I'm wondering how has studying or writing about these fantasy. I mean, I think Elizabeth, you've already touched on this a little bit, but I think how's it allowed maybe, if possible, you personally to maybe process your individual cultural identity or memory, or not even maybe for you personally, maybe maybe the culture around you. And have you had any sort of surprising revelations in this more academic process? And we can start this time with Elizabeth, since you're just kind of discussing this.
Well, yeah, I was about to say I can go on to talk about memory culture. This is actually my big presentation that I did. The big like preparation I did for this panel was trying to figure out how to talk about this like very complicated concept of memory culture, which this German literary scholar and an Egyptologist, Professors Aleda and Jan Assmann, came up with, building on the idea of a guy named a French philosopher named Maurice Hauptwachs. Awkwardly, Maurice Hauptwachs was killed by the Nazis, just quick aside. So it's always really important for German literary scholars in general that we always just like drop when someone was a Nazi or was killed by a Nazi. It's how we interact with our memory culture. But so essentially memory culture is this discipline that explores how human beings remember their past. Essentially, the Assmanns argued that our memories are socially and culturally based phenomena, not these sort of ontological things. And so the basic example is that I have a lot of memories of like my grandmother and my grandfather, but not really of my great uncle, even though I met all those three people only when I was a small kid, and they died when I was, below the age of 10. partially because my family like still celebrates my grandparents' death days and talks about them, whereas like my great uncle has like less of a connection. And so the idea is that like memory culture is that like memory is a social thing, and how you talk about it, and like especially on a like person to person communicative level is really important, and then also just sort of a bigger cultural level. And so the ASPAMs pretty much defined a vehicle by which collected cultural memory is passed from one generation to the next, which like goes into like knowledge that determines a society's awareness of time and history, as well as self-image, which again, very important for Germans because we had that World War II Holocaust thing. And so a huge element of, and this was something that I found very strange when I moved outside of Germany, was that a lot of people would ask me sort of like, you know, oh, so what about that Holocaust? And I would be extremely comfortable talking about it because like all of my fiction from when I was about 6 was about the Holocaust, because it's something so important that we just talk about our guilt in it as like white non-Jewish Germans and stuff. But so it's been really interesting because this sort of framework, this academic framework of like studying the past is hugely important to how we understand the present, obviously like very strongly links to this idea of ghosts. How do you interact with them? And so the idea of like the haunted house and the ghost in the haunted house being intergenerational trauma. In a lot of American narratives, what you're going to do is you're going to try and kill the ghost. And so much of what like memory culture says is they're like, why don't you talk to that ghost? See what that ghost was remembering and what you're forgetting, which has just always been a really interesting sort of tension. And it's been super fun to sort of follow that through in a bunch of different fantasy contexts specifically.
I want more stories about us talking to the ghosts rather than just try to like stomp them. That would actually just be so much more interesting to me.
So Marie, would you like to provide some thoughts on the subject as well?
Sure. I mean, when it comes to sort of that, like, you know, cultural memory kind of aspect, I am so much the stereotypically like white American perspective on this, which is to say my ancestors come from about 6 different places and I have about 0 connection to any of them, right? Like, I definitely inherited some cultural practices, mostly from the Scandinavian parts of my mother's family, that there are things that I didn't even like realize were kind of a cultural practice until I sort of, you know, got out into the world and went, oh, like not everybody makes those things at Christmas. Got it. But we don't get the narratives. Like, or rather, I have not gotten the narratives. I didn't like inherit any traditional stories that were told to me when I was a kid. There were like a few rhymes that my mother would recite, which I have sort of a phonetic memory of them, and I don't know if they're supposed to be Norwegian or Swedish, but what's coming out of my mouth is neither of those things. Like, they're just syllables. Like, that's the level I'm at. But growing up, like from a very early age, I loved reading about this kind of thing. I have always found it interesting, not necessarily directly as a, oh, you know, this is where my people came from, but for everybody. Like, I've got shelves in my library that are just collections of folk tales and such from different parts of the world. Like, family members travel and they will come back for me with whatever English language books they could find on, you know, the folklore. So like, I've got a couple from Laos or whatever. And so I like reading that kind of thing because you get both kind of the universality and the specificity sort of popping up there, you know, mentioning with the women who died in childbirth, you have, you know, some sort of vengeful ghost or whatever. You know, that's kind of a semi-universal thing. You see that a lot. But then you also get the stuff that is really, really specific to the place that it comes from. And I love seeing the mix of those things, both the stuff that I can kind of recognize parallels and the things where I go, that is so embedded in this place that I can't imagine seeing that somewhere else.
Ishan? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. I just wanted to mention, first of all, that I also have a collection of Lao folk tales. And also what Elizabeth was saying about, talking to the ghosts, that was what Vita Cruz was talking about that in her workshop, this idea of like, can we have, you know, decolonial ways of resolving in conflict, of, you know, instead of battling the monster, can we learn how to embrace these shadows? And okay, I'm going to share a couple of revelations I think I had when I was researching Singapore sort of monster culture. And one thing a few people have noted in Singapore is the way, strangely, with our monsters from different cultures seem to live in harmony. Okay, Singapore is a multi-ethnic country. We've got about 80% of us are Chinese. They also got the indigenous Malay population. A lot of colonial influence from the Brits, and we've noticed that in collections of true ghost stories and in later works of horror and fantasy, there's this a lot of comfort in having Chinese ghosts and Malay ghosts and other ghosts next to one another, and some folks have said, well, this is we it's in this interesting form of syncretism, because although we've got different religions going on and it's kind of taboo to worship each other's gods, we can be scared of each other's ghosts. And so, the idea of having this, I think they've called it a supernatural kitchen sink kind of world building is it's actually helped to create this it actually reflects a healthy-ish form of cultural mixing that I hope to see moving forward. I mean, there's also been like a zombie craze in Singapore culture as well, so that it just keeps on evolving with different influences. And the second thing I did a presentation about was realizing that I don't think there is actually that big a difference between our monsters and our ghosts, because as I mentioned, there's theories that the Pontianak is originally a goddess. And while I was doing the workshop, I was mentioning, well, I'm a gay man, and so I'm probably not going to have any children. So no one's going to offer me, give me offerings after I'm dead. So in Chinese lore, that means I'm going to become a hungry ghost. And so the idea, whereas if I was given offerings, I would be, a ghost who can give, I would be an ancestor and be able to give blessings to the family. And so the duality of being of being something that should be revered and something that should be feared is just, it's paper thin, and it's not even a matter of good bad. I was talking about Universal Studios has Halloween Horror Nights where they turn the whole park into scare zones. There's a one in Singapore, and one year they invited these Thai horror filmmakers to do a workshop, and they decided, there's the snake spirit, the Naga, who is usually seen as something sacred, but people are kind of scared of snakes, so let's do a whole scare zone about the snake spirit coming to seek revenge on people. And I was realizing, they're from Thailand, and yet they're not worried about this idea of perverting their own culture. What they actually are sort of what they know is that more people in Singapore will learn about the Naga spirit, and hence will have some reverence for her through this horror culture, than if they kept her in this pure form of something to be propitiated. And I'm kind of comforted with that. Maybe as a hungry ghost, I'll be able to have some worshippers too.
And actually, just to build on that, I do think that part of the the paper thin line between our ghosts and our monsters, because I think that that's so correct, is partially also what do we want to remember? And so one of the big things that there is there's not a lot of this, but there is some Jewish German fiction that shows, ghosts from the Holocaust. And obviously those ghosts are very angry and murdery and extremely okay. But those ghosts are sort of terrifying. And, the ghosts of German soldiers who died in the trenches, those are also angry and lonely. And so it's kind of do we want to remember that part of our culture? Do we want to celebrate that? Or is this ghost something that we're trying to hide? Is it something we're trying to put in the back of the house?
We've also got loads of World War II ghosts in Singapore. It was the Japanese who invaded us, and they, at the very start, they decided, let's just round up all the healthy-looking men and shoot them on the beach. So there's that's actually left a large, it's become a large part of our horror consciousness and lore.
Oh, that's
That all sounds really fascinating. So given a lot of these historical events and how they've intervened in history, what sort of major changes have you observed in the way we write or view folkloric beings or horror beings over time? And I guess what do you think's contributed primarily contributed to these trends? Like coming from your perspective, both as someone living the culture and also maybe studying it or writing it. And we can start with Marie. How about you start?
Right. Well, since it already came up a little bit, I think one of the biggest things that I've seen is around things like, okay, you have these demonic, scary, dangerous, like female ghosts and such. You definitely have gotten a lot of the kind of feminist reinterpretation and re-examining of these kinds of creatures, both in terms of like coming at it from several angles. You have on the one hand the kind of psychological assessment of like, oh, Freud would have a field day with the fear of women's power and so forth, and oh, you have to drive a nail into the back of the head. Well, there's some phallic imagery for you. Like, get a lot of that sort of analysis. Also things that are trying to like either reclaim kind of the power and the force of these things as being a positive thing, stuff that looks at the historical development and can we see evidence of, well, maybe it was a different thing in the past that then got demonized when Islam came in, when Christianity came in, and took sort of what was indigenous and said, oh, that's all demons. That's kind of the big trend that I've seen, and especially around female creatures.
Yeah, in Singapore's case, what I've seen, well, there's always been some sympathy for a lot of these creatures, I think, but we've actually across the decades, we've seen more involvement of increased involvement of women writers, increased involvement of ethnic minority writers reclaiming these stories, and actually, rather than just the notion of sympathy and empathy, it's what we're seeing more of is a turn away from horror, as in these creatures, they used to be in a collection in these pulp collections that were very clearly meant to like give you a cheap a cheap thrill and a scare, but now it's with the growth of the idea of speculative fiction as a literary genre, it's much more about like, well, we've got how do we incorporate monsters into these ideas of new worlds? How do we what can we make from them which is more complex? How do we understand them not just as not just as things that are out to get us, but part of an ecosystem, if you will.
And Elizabeth?
Yeah, and I totally agree. I actually, in the second you said that, usually I thought of, I can't remember the author though. This is the embarrassing thing. I was like, can I Google this real fast? The genie, the genie book that's set in New York in the 1920s, and it's very much about it. The Golem and the Genie is what it's called.
Helen Wecker.
There we go. Thank you.
I love
maybe Helene. Definitely Wecker. WeckE.
We got it. H. Wecker. But yeah, I love that book because it was so much about bringing those monsters, sort of your cultural monsters, to the new land and the new place. And one of the things that I've definitely noticed in the sort of change in the trends of ghost fiction is that I feel like we sort of Anglophone publishing has become more and more interested in different cultural ghosts. And how we think about them. And so a big one for me, actually, again, building up what Yixing was saying, I read The Ghost Bride by Yang Chu, which is a historical fantasy set in 1890s colonial Malaysia. And it has this sort of colonial world of the dead. And you have that and then you also have Aidan Thomas's Cemetery Boys, which is very recent YA. And that's by Aidan Thomas, and that's about Latinx ghosts in East LA as immigrants. And they talk a lot about the idea of importing your ghosts and how you bring them. And Alasso by Darcy Little Badger which I haven't read. But
I
I'm
was going to recommend that one.
about. Yeah, exactly. Which is a lot about like Native American ghosts and how like it's not other people bringing their ghosts, but it's you dealing with your own ghosts when there are other people around you. So I've just really enjoyed that sort of like the globalization of the sort of ghosts, and how they're both like deeply universal. Everyone dies. And also how they are just like deeply personal. You know, Cemetery Boys was so Latinx. It was so much about the Latinx death experience. And same for Yangtze Chu's The Ghost Bride. And I just find that that's something that I've been really enjoying as sort of a publishing trend, just like at publishing. Continue with this, please. That just like super fun.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Elatsnoe because it actually does something really interesting. It's a world where, like, I guess this stuff is, it's an open kind of urban fantasy where, people know that this exists rather than it being a hidden society. And at one point, the main character is actually lamenting that, you're basically getting the equivalent to like those endless fields of monocropped corn, that in fact the Midwest, the Great Plains, are being taken over by like your standard kind of scarecrow ghost, like European supernatural horror creatures are the ones that are now spreading across the Great Plains, kind of like an invasive species, basically, and that they're crowding out the local, the local crops and the local spirits. So it's a nice kind of metaphorical approach to that.
And so going kind of on a related topic, I guess I'm wondering if each of you have a perspective on how either fantasy or horror can allow us to sort of explore our own humanity. And the question is very related, but how do these stories reflect on us? Um, yeah, and because we've talked a lot more about macroscopically about culture, but what about us individually? And Yisheng, do you want to start?
Wait, could it was my ADD brain. Could someone else answer that because I wasn't paying proper attention?
Okay. Elizabeth, or Elizabeth, do you want to start?
I'm happy to jump in, because I think that death is such an intrinsically universal thing. Everyone dies, but I think the sort of awareness and interests of sort of social traditions, but also sort of social consciousness around death. How do we talk about it? How do we not talk about it? Shifts so much in different cultures, and I think that stories about ghosts, especially ones that both play on the universality and the very specific cultural elements. And I'm going to hark back to Cemetery Boys again, because I think that book did a really interesting thing by talking about ghosts and talking about how Dia de los Muertos is very much for sort of Latinx people a super important time to be able to reconnect with your ghosts. But you can't have that if you're not Latinx. You can't access that tradition. And there's a really interesting sort of tension in the book where one of the other characters is Latinx, but has never really practiced, is not a brujo, is not practicing in any way. And as a result, even he can't access the sort of true, ghost reuniting element of Dia de los Muertos. And so I think that one of the things that sort of dark fantasy and horror really allows us to think about and talk about is how do we connect to our dead, and how do we not just personally, but also sort of as a culture talk about and think about our dead. And sort of, the thing in Germany is we have a lot of memorials all over the place. One of the things that I always love to talk to people about is this concept of Stolpersteine, which is literally tripping stones. And we have tripping stones in every single German city, like town, village, they all have them, because they're always placed in front of houses where Jewish people were deported from. And they're quite literally just like a little stone like this big, and that just says like the name. And they don't say anything else. And if it's in front of a synagogue, they'll just say the name of the synagogue, but it is something physical to stop you. It's literally supposed to trip you, to remind you what was there, make you think about it, and then move on. And so I think that so much of sort of the stories we tell talk to us and talk to specific parts of us. And so I really love that. I think the sort of, for example, sort of the crop up of haunted house novels that I think has come in the last like 10 years too, has been speaking so much about that sort of gothic horror of the woman trapped in a house, the woman unable to leave in the house as something that eats women, sort of to connect to Marie's idea of sort of the feminist monsters too. And so I've been really enjoying the way that I find that dark horror can really ask us like important questions about what we're doing and whether or not we're really thinking through things. And so I've really been enjoying this.
I'm just gonna say briefly, you talking about, like being trapped in the house, etc. Now I'm wondering if we're gonna see this like crop in about 6 months to a year of like the haunted Zoom kind of like somebody coming up with the ghosts of the Zoom call or something, as we've all felt trapped in these sorts of things.
Yeah. Yeah, Yisheng, do you have any thoughts?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think it's very similar when when you're talking about when you're able to give voice to the inhuman. I mean, I've been writing stuff from the perspective of the Hantu, the ghosts, and as they comment on human society, it's a way of sort of like reflecting on the actual cruelties of humanity, because in the real world it's true, like we are our own it's human constructs which are our own worst enemies. Our the 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 demons aren't as much out to get us as really cruel humans and human social constructs are.
Actually, our constructs, when you get sort of analytical about it, one of the ways that you can look at a lot of folkloric creatures, especially the horrifying ones, are that they in some way like violate the categories that we think with and that we use to construct the world. And so like ghosts and undead in general, they blur the line between what's alive and what's dead. And we kind of want, as people, for it to be really clear what is alive and what is dead, and they should not meet. That disturbs us when that happens. Uh, and so I think that's one of the things that you can get when you look at these kinds of creatures, is you can say, all right, I'm not going to claim that this is like a rigid thing, that everything you can say, oh, here are the categories and here's how it's violating them. But that's one of the ways that you can look at some of them. And it tells you something about how people organize the world, that they say these things should be separate. And it's why, you get certain kinds of horror, I think, maybe not like supernatural horror, but stuff that the shock effect of it is meant to come from, oh, well, these things are supposed to be separate and they blur and this makes me uncomfortable, which obviously right now with a lot of the discussions that we're having about things like gender and so forth, we're now questioning a lot more of that and saying, all right, rather than viewing this as a source of, oh no, my order of the world has been violated, maybe we change our thinking around that.
So, given that, on to, our next question, I'm wondering, uh, given that our culture is becoming a lot more, we have a lot more mixing of cultures and interactions of different cultural memories, and I think that so that creates a lot of mixing. And how do you think this is going to affect, say, the direction of fantasy and horror? Because let's say, like someone like me, say a Chinese American immigrant in the States, or from an immigrant family, is going to grow up with the different mythologies. So how do you think that's going to affect fantasy and horror?
I think we've touched on some of that already, just in talking about things like Elatsoe, where there's a number of stories out there that are using the supernatural as a lens for looking at things like immigration or invasive species or colonialism or having mixed heritage and such, that you're drawing from multiple parts of the world. I don't think that all fantasy is necessarily being allegorical about the ordinary human experience, but that's definitely one of the things it can do, and I see a lot of that happening.
Elizabeth, do you want to talk about that?
I think that one of the things I'm really excited about is that I feel like there has started to be an interest in fantasy in general of also looking at works in translation. Over the last like 5 years, I feel like I have read a lot of Korean horror and a lot of like Polish horror and Russian fantasies. And I think that that kind of extremely granular from an entirely different culture, a fantasy novel that walks in with a totally different set of base assumptions and that really challenges the reader has been something that I've been really, really enjoying. And the way I find that those sort of cultures that I have sort of, especially with like Polish and Russian culture, there are a fair amount of Polish and sort of Eastern European refugee or immigrants in Germany that came in predominantly in the 80s and 90s. So they've been in Germany for a really long time, but so it's been really interesting to read these books and sort of understand a little bit more of those sort of cultural moments. And so that's, I think, a thing I'm really excited about fantasy shifting towards like looking at those other perspectives and looking at how those other cultures think about their ghosts and demons in a way that isn't always like extremely translatable, but is often worth, like holding on to that sort of like, I don't know if I understand this for the first 50% of the book, and then being like, oh, now I get it. And so I feel like that's been something that I've been really enjoying about this shift in sort of more global fantasy has been sort of an interest in sort of non mainstream stories in the representation.
I'm going to be a little more gloomy. I think that there's also this danger of a kind of more tokenistic understanding of cosmopolitan, cosmopolitan demonology. I'll say like this way. In the case of say a show and a book like American Gods, which samples from the world's pantheons and is based on just like say not and not necessarily very deep research into any one culture, as in you take the most famous gods from each region, have them pop up, and feel like when you have horror series that they will okay, yeah, here's a Chinese ghost, here's a Filipino ghost, and they'll go with the most obvious ghost, and through that you sort of you might get praise for representation, and you would be demonstrating some kind of cultural competence, but that's very different from writers from these cultures, and sometimes to be from this culture, yeah, it's not just blood descent. It's actually living in that place and seeing how that culture changes, and like that understands sort of that the depth and the depth and the range and the entire different cosmology that goes into these spirits. And I guess I'm worrying a little that the expectations um, of US and UK centered publishing and audiences, that's gonna flatten things a little.
Okay.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I very much agree with that. And it's one of the reasons why what Elizabeth was saying about seeing more stuff translated into English from other parts of the world is a super important thing for us to have. And I have seen more of it lately, which I'm really glad of. And I'm hoping we get more of that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely as when as an Anglophone writer, I feel like I'm writing for a global audience. I feel like there is this little thing that this temptation to self-exoticize a little more, and the great and that interesting thing about translated work is that that person was writing for an audience that wasn't yours. And sometimes that will mean the story isn't actually going to work that well for an international audience, but it also means that, you're going to get something different.
Yes. So I'd like to, so I've announced in the Discord that we are going to have a quick Q&A, and we are, and I realized I have run a little time limit for that. So I get our first question from Continental Pearl. I think Lovecraftian horror is at its best when done by creators who are using it in ways that would make Lovecraft roll in his grave, like Lovecraft himself, the absolute worst. I think we all agree. Creators who are marginalized, slash othered by their societies, using cosmic horror and tropes historically used to vilify them, to instead explore ideas about race and disability, gender, and who gets included slash excluded. Question mark. Sorry, I didn't ask that in a very clear way, but creators who do that.
I know there has been a big boom in that kind of thing recently. Like I've read reviews of things that like Ruth Anna Emrys is doing, or like some of Sonia Taife's work. However, I don't tend to like that kind of horror, so I don't read it myself, and I'm not super up on it. I just know there's been a huge swing of exactly the kind of people that Lovecraft really did not have good feelings about, taking his stuff and doing their own things with it, and I think that's awesome.
I'm sort of in the same boat as Marie, as in like, I've never read Lovecraft. I watched one horror movie one time that was based on a Lovecraft story because a girlfriend asked me to, and I was like, well, I guess I've seen Lovecraft now. Sort of the other name that I see thrown about a lot is, The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, as, being an intrinsically Lovecraftian story. I haven't read it yet. I'm extremely excited to read it, though.
That's an interesting comparison, because I've read the short story, or maybe it was a novelette. I haven't read the novel yet. I wouldn't have thought of it as being in that genre, but I haven't read the novel, so I don't know if the longer version goes more that way.
I just saw a tweet thread on it by N.K. Jemisin herself, so that is why I know that, because I was like, neat, okay, great, I'll read this. And so if anyone ever asked me if I read Lovecraft, I could say no, but I read N.K. Jemisin instead.
Fair enough, and I'm not going to argue with her assessment of it.
Yeah, but in general, that there is that delight in folks like gay people, and and ethnic minorities and disabled who have been compared to monsters ourselves, finally grasping that metaphor ourselves, and yes, say and embodying the delight in embodying the monstrous that I think a lot of us are, yeah, a lot of us can revel in. And ironically, I think because Lovecraft was talking about the the unindescribability of that, you go like, well, one size fits all, I suppose.
Okay. And and there's another question from CL Holland. What are the panelists' favorite books of / about mythology?
That's hard.
Yeah, right. I was going to say, ooh.
Yeah, I know. I know there's a lot to choose from. So, off the top of your head, let's do a free for all. Like anything you can think of.
All right, I'll toss out, just because this is the thing that's most fresh in my mind. Because I was writing about a bunch of Japanese yokai, did a lot of research into that, and there's a guy named Matthew Meyer who's been living in Japan for I don't know how many years, and has been like traveling around to the yokai museum that they have there and such, and digging into the historical sources, because he can read Japanese well enough to do that, which I cannot. So I relied on his books that he's been putting out. He's just got his fourth one coming out now. And they're a really great compendium that shows you not only like, okay, here's a creature, but then it will talk about, and there's regional variants, like it's called this in this place and the story's slightly different there. And you can see, that these things don't fit into clean little boxes. That's one of the things that comes through in his book, which I think is good.
Mine isn't a nonfiction book, and it's kind of cheating, but genuinely just reading the original Grimm's fairy tales. This is a fun sort of meme that a lot of Germans my age talk about, is how we sort of grew up being read to by our parents and listening to audiobooks, because audiobooks were a huge thing in Germany in the 90s, but listening to like Grimm's fairy tales, and like people get murdered and gruesomely disemboweled and eaten and all those things in sort of the original ones. And so that's still sort of my biggest touch point for when I'm sort of thinking about folklore and thinking about the history of Germany, because so much of the things that Grimm's fairy tales talks about having sort of fear, and you know, there's sort of the fear of the forest and stuff that are still like very prevalent and very important. So yeah, I just read Grimm.
It's terrible that I mean, when I think about the books I loved as a kid, they were very much these really colorful, you know, books about introductory books about mythology, which were, you know, which kind of were, you know, were coming from a colonial lens, despite, you know, in their very desire to be cosmopolitan. I, you know, like Usborne mythologies, but it's and Roger Lancelyn Green's retellings. But I suppose one recent work which I was quite impressed by was a book about Chinese gods and goddesses called From Guan Yin to Chairman Mao. That was actually written by someone from China, and like so it was like literally saying like there are these ancient temples, these are the writings about them in these medieval texts, and these are how they're represented in 21st century computer games. So it's like quite really like she really knew her stuff.
I'm definitely going to go buy that one.
Oh, so I think we're about out of time, but I guess we can all have if we all have some final thoughts, feel free to give them, and if we can go around and also say where we can find you online and also what you're working on at the moment. Do we want to start with Isha?
Well, I don't have a link tree yet to a proper website, but I'm sharing everything I read and eat on Instagram at Yish Kebab, YISHKABOB. I mean, and like, all these online lectures as well, because I go like if I put it on social media, then I will have somewhere to Google it if I can't remember what I read. And yeah, what I'm working on a few things now, but the one I should promote is I have edited a collection of 1950s originally Malay language horror stories by a journalist turned politician from Singapore called Othman Wok. We're calling it A Mosque in the Jungle. I'm really quite delighted with it because it's you know it's showing that Singapore's horror culture goes back further than we normally talk about it. But I'm also working on a novel about pre-colonial Singapore. I've got a novel at a second draft about a toyol, which is this child of this spirit of an unborn baby, which you can keep in a little bottle and get you to, you know, and get to grant you wishes. You can actually buy them on eBay these days, and yeah, and in the story, the toyol is a private investigator. So I'm hoping, yeah. So if if any agents are interested in that,
Yeah, that sounds really awesome. Marie?
I'm online at swantower.com or swan_tower on Twitter. And what I'm working on right now is the third book of the series that The Mask of Mirrors is the first book of. These are co-written with my friend Alyssa Helms under the name M.A. Carrick. And those, I'll just say from the topic of this panel, it's been interesting because it's not directly based on any one specific culture, so we're having to come up with our own creatures, like Zlazin and Pearl Ghosts and everything. And it's been fun to try and like come up with suitable creatures that feel folkloric without just being we yoink that from this specific place.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, you can find me at spacelesbian.zone. That's my website, or at Willow Cabins on Twitter or Instagram. And I am currently working on a draft of a novel of a young woman who has to free her sister's ghost from a giant war ghost. It's a pretty blatant World War II story. We are having a great time with it. And I recently moved back to Germany, and so I've also just been writing a ton of short fiction because moving back to Germany and then starting a master's degree in German literature means that I've been reading tons of sort of German language, German literature that I had just missed when I was a kid because it wasn't kid appropriate. And so I've just been really enjoying sort of writing Anglophone short fiction that really interacts with a lot of those like literary traditions that I had just never really thought of that much, and sort of rediscovering that. and rediscovering just like silly things like sentence construction and how those just really, really impact the way that a lot of German fiction, because one of the big ways that German fiction happened post World War II, in the sort of 5 years after 1945, the Americans stopped all printing presses from running. And so audio literature became a huge thing, radio plays and stuff. And so it's been super fun sort of exploring that and exploring how to try and write that again in written fiction. So yeah, that's what I'm working on.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. And thank you all. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for joining today and giving us all their thoughts and their pearls of wisdom, and also thank everyone who is joining in on the discussion on Discord. And that is the end of our panel. Thank you all very much. Bye,
Thank you.
everybody.